I didn't tell many people about this for a long time because it sounded like the kind of story you hear once and assume the person is either exaggerating or leaving something out. I'm not someone who scares easily, and I've camped more times than I can count, mostly across state parks in the Midwest and up into the Rockies. I follow the rules, I plan ahead, and I don't mess around with anything that feels off. That's probably why this stuck with me the way it did, because I did everything right that weekend. This happened in late September, a few years back, in National Forest in Colorado. I had taken a few days off work because I needed the break. It had been a rough couple of months, and I wanted something quiet, something where I didn't have to deal with people or noise. I picked a less popular trail system that had a handful of dispersed campsites along a long loop. Nothing extreme, just a moderate hike with good elevation and a lot of tree cover. I had been there once before, years earlier, so I knew the general layout. I got there mid-afternoon on a Friday. The parking lot wasn't empty, but it wasn't crowded either. There were maybe 6 or 7 cars scattered around. That was normal for that time of year. The weather was cool but stable, and the forecast was clear for the whole weekend. I packed my gear, double-checked everything, and started the hike around 3. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was well marked, and I passed a couple heading out as I was going in. We did the usual quick nod, nothing more. After that, I didn't see anyone else. The deeper I got, the quieter it became, which was exactly what I wanted. I had a specific campsite in mind. It wasn't official, but it was a known spot among people who had done the trail. It sat a little off the main path, near a small creek, with enough flat ground for a tent and a decent natural windbreak from the trees. The last time I had been there, it was empty, and I figured there was a good chance it would be again. It took me a little longer than expected to reach it, because I had stopped a couple of times along the way. By the time I got close, the light was starting to shift into early evening. Not dark yet, but that point where you know you should start setting up soon. As I got within maybe 100 yards of the campsite, I noticed something that made me slow down. There was no obvious movement, but the area didn't look empty. It's hard to explain exactly what I mean by that, but if you've camped enough, you know when a place has been used recently. The ground looks different. There's a kind of disturbance to it. When I stepped into the clearing, I saw the tent. It was already set up. At first, I just assumed someone had beaten me to it. That happens. It wasn't a big deal. The tent was a standard 2-person dome. Nothing unusual about it. Dark green, maybe a little worn. It was positioned right in the middle of the best flat spot, exactly where I would have put mine. I stood there for a few seconds, just taking it in. There were no other signs of activity. No backpack leaning against a tree. No shoes outside the tent. No food hanging, nothing. Just the tent. I called out, just in case the person was nearby. "Hey, anyone here?" No response. I waited a bit, then tried again, a little louder. "Hello?" Still nothing. That's when I started to feel a little uneasy. Not enough to leave, but enough to pay attention. It wasn't unusual for someone to set up camp and then go off exploring, but most people leave something behind that makes it obvious they're still around. I walked a little closer, staying a few feet away from the tent. The front flap was zipped shut. There was no light coming from inside, which made sense given the time of day. I listened for any movement, but it was completely quiet. I told myself not to overthink it. The simplest explanation was that someone had set up early and gone for a hike. I decided I'd wait a few minutes and see if anyone came back. I dropped my pack near a tree and sat down on a rock facing the tent. I kept my distance out of respect, but I stayed close enough that if someone returned, I could talk to them. The plan was simple. If the spot was taken, I'd move on and find another place before it got dark. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing. I started to notice smaller details that didn't sit right. The tent looked like it had been there for a while, not just a few hours. There was a thin layer of dust on parts of it, especially near the bottom edges. The stakes were driven in firmly, like they hadn't been adjusted recently. The ground around it was slightly compressed, as if it had been used more than just once or twice. I got up and walked a slow circle around it, still keeping a bit of distance. There were no footprints that stood out, at least none that looked fresh. The soil was dry enough that it didn't hold impressions well, but still, I expected to see something. That's when I noticed the zipper. It was fully closed, but not in a clean way. One side was slightly off, like it had been forced or misaligned at some point. It wasn't broken, but it didn't sit right. I don't know why that detail bothered me more than anything else, but it did. I stood there for another minute, debating whether to just move on or take a closer look. Part of me felt like it wasn't my place to mess with someone else's gear. The other part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was wrong. I called out one more time, louder than before. "Hey, I'm just checking if this site's taken." The sound carried into the trees and faded out. No answer. At that point, I made a decision that I still go back and question sometimes. I stepped closer and reached out toward the tent. I didn't open it right away. I just touched the fabric first. It was cold. Not just cool from the air, but noticeably colder than everything around it. The temperature outside was mild, maybe in the low 60s, but the tent fabric felt like it had been sitting in shade all day in much colder weather. I pulled my hand back, a little surprised. I told myself it didn't mean anything. It could have been the material, or maybe it had been in shadow longer than I realized. There were explanations. Still, I hesitated before grabbing the zipper. I pulled it slowly, just enough to create a small opening. The inside was dark, but not completely. There was just enough light filtering in for me to see shapes. At first, I thought the tent was empty. Then my eyes adjusted a little more, and I saw that it wasn't. There was a sleeping bag inside. It was laid out flat, like someone had been using it. There was also a backpack in the corner, partially unzipped. It looked old, older than the tent even. The fabric was faded, and one of the straps looked like it had been repaired with tape. I opened the zipper a little more and leaned in slightly, just enough to get a better look. That's when I realized something else. The sleeping bag wasn't just laid out. It was occupied. Not in the way you'd expect, though. It wasn't like someone was clearly lying there. There was no visible head, no clear outline of a body. But the shape of the bag wasn't flat either. It was slightly raised in the middle, like there was something inside it. I froze for a second, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. My first thought was that someone was sleeping, and I was about to wake them up in the worst possible way. I immediately felt like I had crossed a line. "Hey," I said, quieter this time. "Sorry, I didn't know." I stopped mid-sentence, because the shape didn't move. Not even a little. If someone was inside that sleeping bag, they would have reacted by now. Even the sound of the zipper should have been enough. But there was nothing. No shifting, no breathing, nothing. I stayed there, crouched by the opening, waiting for some kind of response. It didn't come. I don't know how long I held that position, but it felt longer than it probably was. Eventually, I pulled back slightly, still holding the zipper open, and tried to look at it from a different angle. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The sleeping bag was zipped all the way up. From the outside, the zipper ran cleanly from the bottom to the top, with the pull tab resting near what would have been the person's head. There was no gap, no opening, nothing. Whoever or whatever was inside that sleeping bag had been sealed in. I let go of the tent flap and stepped back immediately. The zipper slid shut on its own with a soft sound, closing the opening I had made. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the tent, trying to process what I had just seen. There are a lot of ways to explain something like that if you really try. Maybe it was gear packed in a way that just looked like a body. Maybe someone had stuffed the sleeping bag with clothes or equipment. Maybe I had misinterpreted what I saw because of the lighting. I went through all of those explanations in my head, one after the other, but none of them felt solid. I should have left right then. That would have been the smart move. Pack up, head back to the trail, find another spot, or even just hike out if I had to. Instead, I stayed. Part of it was stubbornness. I had planned this trip, and I didn't want to give up the campsite without being sure. The other part was something else, something I didn't want to admit at the time. I was curious, and that curiosity kept me there longer than it should have. I picked up my pack and moved it a little farther from the tent, closer to the edge of the clearing. I didn't want to set up right next to it, but I also didn't want to leave the area entirely. I told myself I'd set up a temporary spot, keep an eye on things, and if anything fell off, I'd leave. As I started laying out my gear, I kept glancing back at the tent. It didn't move. It didn't make a sound. It just sat there, exactly as it had when I arrived. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt like I wasn't alone there in the way I had expected. And that was before the sun went down. I didn't know it yet, but finding that tent was the least disturbing part of that night. By the time I finished setting up my own tent, the light had dropped off more than I realized. In that part of the forest, once the sun dips behind the trees, it gets dark fast. I didn't waste time making things comfortable. I just got the essentials in place, unrolled my sleeping bag, and kept everything within reach. I made a quick meal, nothing complicated, and ate while sitting on a fallen log near the edge of the clearing. I kept my headlamp off for as long as I could to let my eyes adjust naturally. The woods were quiet in a normal way at first. You could hear the usual background sounds, the wind moving lightly through the trees, the occasional movement of something small in the brush, distant water from the creek. But every so often, I caught myself listening for something else. I wasn't sure what I expected to hear. Movement from the tent, maybe. A zipper. A voice. Anything that would confirm there was a normal explanation for what I saw earlier. Nothing came. Once it got fully dark, I switched on my headlamp. The beam cut a clean line through the clearing and landed directly on the other tent. It looked exactly the same as before. No shift, no change. No sign that anyone had returned. I checked my phone out of habit, even though I already knew there was no signal. It was a little after 8, too early to sleep, but late enough that most people would have settled in for the night if they were camping. I thought about calling out again, but something about doing that in the dark didn't feel right. During the day, it had felt reasonable. Now it felt like I'd be drawing attention to myself in a way I couldn't control. Instead, I stayed quiet. I cleaned up what little I had used, packed away my food, and hung it a short distance from my tent. I didn't go far. I kept everything within a range of my headlamp, so I wouldn't lose sight of the clearing. The other tent stayed in view the entire time. At one point, I forced myself to walk past it again, pretending I was just checking the perimeter. I didn't stop this time. I didn't touch it. I just moved slowly, letting the edge of my light pass over it. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. There was no condensation on it. By that time of night, with the temperature dropping, most tents start to show at least a little moisture on the surface, especially near the bottom edges. Mine already had a faint layer forming along the sides. The other one didn't. It looked dry, almost like it wasn't reacting to the temperature the same way everything else was. I told myself it could be the material or the angle it was set up at, but it added to the growing list of things that didn't quite fit. I went back to my tent and zipped myself in. I left the flap slightly open so I could still see out toward the clearing. My headlamp stayed on for a while longer, angled low so it lit the ground between me and the other tent. I tried to distract myself by going over simple things in my head. Plans for the next day. the route I'd take, what time I'd start hiking. It worked for a bit. Then I heard something. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even clear at first. Just a small shift in the sound around me, like something had changed position. I held still and listened. There it was again. A faint movement coming from the direction of the other tent. I sat up slowly, careful not to make any noise, and turned my headlamp slightly to the right so the beam landed closer to it. The tent was still. I kept listening. Another sound, this time a little more distinct. It reminded me of fabric brushing against fabric, a slow, deliberate movement. My first thought was that whoever owned the tent had finally come back and was getting inside. That would have explained everything. I almost felt relief at the idea, but that didn't line up with what I was seeing. The tent hadn't moved when someone entered it. There had been no footsteps, no approach, nothing leading up to that sound. It had just started, as if it had been happening all along, and I had only just noticed it. I watched the tent closely. The surface looked still at first, but after a few seconds, I realized it wasn't completely. There was a slight change in the shape near the center, almost like something inside had shifted position. It wasn't a clear movement, not enough to say definitively that it had moved, but enough that I couldn't ignore it. The sound came again, a little longer this time. I felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with cold or fatigue. I stayed where I was, trying to keep my breathing steady, trying to convince myself there was a normal explanation. Animals can get into tents. That was the first thing I told myself. Small ones, usually. A raccoon, maybe. Something looking for food. That could explain the movement and the sound. But that didn't explain how it got inside a fully zipped tent. I kept watching, and after a while, the movement stopped. The sound faded with it, leaving the clearing quiet again. I didn't relax. I stayed awake, sitting up in my sleeping bag, keeping the light trained in that direction. I don't know how much time passed like that, but eventually, the stillness started to feel normal again. That's when something else happened. The zipper on the other tent moved. It was a small movement, just a few inches, but it was enough to make a clear sound in the quiet. I saw it happen. The pull tab shifted downward slightly, as if someone inside had pulled it. I leaned forward without realizing it. My focus locked on that one spot. The zipper moved again. This time it went up, slowly, not all the way, just a short distance. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just watched. There was a pause, maybe 10 or 15 seconds, and then the zipper slid down again, returning to where it had been. It stopped moving after that. The tent went still. I don't think I fully processed what I had just seen until a few seconds later. When it hit me, it hit all at once. Something inside that tent was moving the zipper from the inside. But earlier, when I had looked in, the sleeping bag had been zipped shut from the outside. That detail locked everything in place in a way that didn't make sense. I felt a strong urge to leave right then, not pack up carefully, not think it through, just grab what I could and get out of there. But it was fully dark, and the trail wasn't something I wanted to navigate in a rush, especially not in that state. So I stayed. I turned off my headlamp after a while because I didn't want to feel like I was exposing myself. The darkness made everything harder to see, but it also made me feel slightly less visible. I lay back, but I didn't close my eyes. At some point, I must have drifted into a light, restless sleep, because I remember snapping awake to a different kind of sound. This one was closer, not from the other tent, from just outside mine. It was the sound of something brushing lightly against the fabric, moving along the side, slow, steady, like a hand trailing across it. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The movement continued, tracing from one side of the tent to the other. It didn't press in hard, just enough to shift the material slightly as it passed. Then it stopped near the front, right by the zipper. I stared at that spot. even though I couldn't see anything clearly in the dark. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard the zipper move. Just a fraction. A small, careful pull, like someone testing it. I reached out and grabbed it from the inside, holding it in place. The movement stopped immediately. We stayed like that for a few seconds, me holding the zipper, whatever was outside no longer pulling. Then, slowly, the pressure on the outside of the tent lifted. The presence moved away. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear anything at all after that. Just silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night. I didn't check the other tent again. I didn't step outside. I just waited for the first sign of daylight, counting the time in my head, trying to keep myself focused on something that made sense. When the light finally started to come through the fabric of my tent, it felt like a release. But the worst part wasn't over yet, because in the morning, I was going to have to look at that other tent again, and I wasn't sure what I was going to find. I didn't rush out the moment it got light. I stayed where I was for a while, listening, making sure there was nothing moving around outside. The forest had that early morning quiet, the kind that slowly fills with normal sounds as the day starts. Birds, wind, distant water. Everything sounded the way it should. That helped, but it didn't fix what had happened during the night. When I finally unzipped my tent, I did it slowly and kept my eyes on the clearing. The first thing I checked was the ground around me. There were no obvious tracks, no disturbed leaves, nothing that showed something had been moving around my tent. That didn't make sense, considering what I had heard and felt, but I didn't dwell on it right away. I stepped out and stood up, stretching a bit just to steady myself. The air was cold, but normal cold, nothing like the strange chill I had felt from the other tent the day before. I looked at it. It was still there, exactly where it had been. No part of it looked different from a distance. No collapse, no damage, no sign that anything had changed overnight. I walked toward it, slower than I usually would, paying attention to every step. I expected to see something new as I got closer. A footprint, a piece of gear, anything that would point to a person being there. There was nothing. When I reached the same spot where I had stood the day before, I stopped. I didn't go right up to it this time. I just looked at it for a moment, trying to decide if I was actually going to open it again. Part of me didn't want to. I had seen enough. I didn't need confirmation, but the other part knew that if I left without checking, I would think about it every time I camped again. I would keep replaying it, wondering if there had been a normal explanation I had missed. So I stepped closer. The zipper was in the same position I had last seen it, fully closed. It didn't look like it had been opened during the night, at least not in any obvious way. I reached out again, more cautious this time, and touched the fabric. It was still cold, not as extreme as before, but noticeably cooler than the air around it. That same unnatural feeling, like it wasn't adjusting to the environment the way it should. I didn't hesitate as long this time. I grabbed the zipper and pulled it open in one smooth motion. The inside of the tent was exactly the same as before. The same sleeping bag, the same backpack, the same arrangement, but something was different. The sleeping bag was flat, completely flat. There was no raised shape in the middle anymore. No suggestion that anything was inside it. It looked like it had been laid out and left empty. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to line that up with what I had seen the day before and what I had heard during the night. It didn't match. I crouched down and opened the tent a little wider, letting more light in. I leaned in just enough to get a clear look at everything. The sleeping bag was still zipped shut from the outside, exactly the same way it had been before. I reached in and pressed down on it. There was nothing inside. No resistance, no shape, nothing that could explain the way it had looked earlier. I pulled my hand back and shifted my focus to the backpack. It hadn't moved either. I opened it carefully, expecting to find something that would explain who had been there. Inside, there were a few basic items. A metal water bottle, empty. A small flashlight that didn't turn on when I pressed a button. Some folded clothes that looked old and stiff, like they had been sitting and used for a long time. At the bottom, there was a notebook. I took it out and flipped it open. Most of the pages were blank. Toward the middle, there were a few entries. The handwriting was uneven, like it had been written quickly or with a shaky hand. The dates caught my attention first. They were from over a year earlier. I read the last entry carefully. It wasn't long. It mentioned the campsite, the same one I was standing in. It said something about hearing movement at night, something outside the tent. The writing got less clear toward the end, like the person had been rushing. The last line didn't finish the sentence. There was no name anywhere in the notebook. I closed it and sat there for a moment, holding it in my hands, trying to process what I was looking at. Whoever had been there had left their gear behind, and not recently. I put the notebook back where I found it and zipped the backpack closed. I didn't want to disturb anything more than I already had. Before I left the tent, I looked at the sleeping bag one more time. There was no sign that anything had been inside it, but I couldn't ignore what I had seen the day before. The shape had been there. I had watched it. I zipped the tent shut and stood up. At that point, my decision was made. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my gear as quickly as I could without being careless. I skipped anything that wasn't necessary. I just wanted to get out of that clearing and back to the main trail. Before I left, I took one last look at the other tent. I considered reporting it, but I didn't know what I would even say. An abandoned tent with some old gear wasn't enough to justify a search, at least not from my perspective at the time. I figured someone else would come across it eventually, maybe someone who would handle it differently. I left the clearing and got back on the trail. The hike out felt longer than the hike in, even though it wasn't. I kept expecting to hear something behind me, something following at a distance, but I never turned around to check. I just kept moving. When I finally reached the parking lot, there were fewer cars than the day before. Mine was still there, untouched. I drove out without stopping. I told myself that once I got back to normal surroundings, everything would settle, that it would start to feel like something I had imagined or misinterpreted. It didn't. Over the next few days, I tried to break it down logically. I went over every detail, every moment, looking for something I could explain. The tent being there made sense. People abandon gear sometimes. The old items inside made sense. Even the notebook, as strange as it was, had a straightforward explanation, but the rest didn't. The shape in the sleeping bag, the movement during the night, the zipper being pulled from the inside, and the thing outside my tent, testing the zipper from the other side. None of that fit into anything I could explain without stretching it to the point where it stopped making sense. About a week later, I called the ranger station for that area. I didn't go into detail. I just mentioned that I had seen an unattended campsite with gear left behind and gave them the general location. The person I spoke to was polite, but there was a pause after I described it. They asked me to repeat the location more precisely, which I did. Then they told me something that I didn't expect. They said they had received a similar report the previous year. Same area, same description. A tent already set up, with no one around. I asked if they had checked it out. They said they had, but when they went to the location, there was nothing there. No tent, no gear, nothing. At the time, I didn't tell them what I had experienced. I just said thank you and ended the call. I haven't gone back to that trail since. I still camp, but I'm more careful about where I set up, and I don't ignore things that feel off the way I did that day. Every now and then, I think about that tent. What stays with me the most isn't just what I saw or heard. It's the part that doesn't change no matter how many times I go over it. That tent was already there when I arrived. It had been there before, and based on what the ranger said, it had also not been there at all. I don't have a clean explanation for that, I just know that whatever was inside it, or around it, didn't need me to open the zipper to get out, because at some point during that night, it was already outside. I tried to leave it behind after that call, but it didn't really work the way I thought it would. For a while, I just avoided thinking about it. I went back to work, got back into routine, and told myself that distance would make it feel less real. It didn't. What changed instead was how I reacted to small things. At night, especially in quiet places, I started noticing details I would have ignored before. The way fabric moves when there's no wind. The sound of something shifting just outside your field of view. The feeling that something is close, even when there's no reason for it to be. About 2 weeks after the trip, something happened that pushed me from uncomfortable memory into something else entirely. I was at home in my apartment. Nothing unusual about the night. I had eaten, watched something for a bit, then went to bed around midnight. I live alone, and my place is small enough that you can hear everything clearly. There aren't many places for sounds to come from without being obvious. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no loud noise, no clear reason. Just that sudden awareness you get when something feels off. I lay there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it. A faint, steady sound. It took me a moment to recognize it, but once I did, I didn't question it. It was the sound of a zipper. Slow, controlled, moving a short distance, then stopping. The exact same kind of movement I had heard in the clearing. I stayed completely still, listening. It came again. Not from outside the apartment. From inside. That's the part that made everything lock into place in the worst possible way. The sound wasn't coming from a window or a door. It was coming from somewhere within the room itself, or just beyond it. I sat up slowly and looked around. Everything looked normal. The door was closed. The window was shut. Nothing was out of place. The sound didn't come again right away. I got out of bed and turned on the light. Silence. I checked the entire apartment, room by room. There was nothing there. No sign of forced entry, no movement, nothing that could explain it. I even checked things that didn't make sense to check, like bags, closets, anything with a zipper, just to make sure I wasn't missing something obvious. Everything was exactly where it should be. I didn't sleep much after that. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it had been something normal. Maybe a sound from another apartment that carried in a strange way. Maybe something I had half dreamed and misinterpreted. That worked for a while. Then I noticed something else. My backpack. The same one I had taken on that trip. I keep it in a corner near the door. I don't use it every day, so it usually just sits there unless I'm planning another hike. One evening, I walked past it and noticed the main zipper was slightly open. Not wide open, just enough to see a small gap. I was sure I had closed it when I got back from the trip. I always do. It's a habit, part how I keep things organized. I told myself I might have left it that way without realizing. I zipped it shut and didn't think much of it. The next morning, it was open again. Same position, same small gap. At that point, I stopped trying to explain it away as carelessness. I emptied the entire bag onto the floor. Every pocket, every compartment. I checked everything carefully. There was nothing in it that didn't belong to me. No extra items. No signs that anyone had gone through it. I put everything back and zipped it shut again. It stayed closed for a couple of days. Then one night, I heard that same sound again. Closer this time. I was awake when it happened, sitting on the edge of my bed, going through something on my phone. The sound came from the direction of the door. I looked up immediately. The backpack was there, and I watched the zipper move. Not all the way, just a small pull downward, then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't go toward it. I just sat there, staring at it, trying to understand what I was seeing in a way that didn't involve the conclusion that was already forming in my head. After a few seconds, the zipper moved back up, returning to where it had been. Then it stopped completely. Nothing else in the room moved. Nothing made a sound. I stayed there for a long time before I did anything. When I finally got up, I walked over slowly and grabbed the bag. I opened it fully and checked inside again, even though I already knew what I would find. Everything was exactly as I had left it, but I didn't feel like it was just my bag anymore. The next day, I made a decision that I probably should have made earlier. I got rid of it. I didn't donate it or store it somewhere. I threw it away. I took it to a disposal site and made sure it wasn't something I would ever come across again by accident. I expected that to be the end of it. For a while it was. The sound stopped. The small things that had been happening around the apartment didn't happen again. I started to feel like maybe I had overreacted. Like maybe removing the bag had just given me a sense of control that I needed. But even now, I don't fully believe that's all it was. Because there's one detail I can't ignore. A few months after all of this, I went on another trip. Not the same place, not even the same state. I chose a busier campground on purpose, somewhere with a lot of people around. I set up my tent in a marked site, surrounded by other campers. There was nothing isolated about it. It should have felt completely normal. And for most of the day, it did. It wasn't until late that night, when things had quieted down, that I noticed something. From inside my tent, looking out through the small gap in the flap, I could see the neighboring sites. Most of them had tents set up. Families, couples, small groups. Everything looked the way it should, except for one. A little farther out, just beyond the nearest cluster of sites, there was a tent that didn't fit. It wasn't part of the organized layout. It sat slightly off to the side, just at the edge of where the light reached. I watched it for a while, waiting to see someone come or go. No one did. It looked familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. Same shape, same size, same dull green color. I didn't leave my tent that night. I didn't go over to check it. I just watched it until I fell asleep. In the morning, it was gone. I asked around casually, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. No one else had noticed anything out of place. As far as they were concerned, every site had been accounted for. I didn't argue with them. I packed up and left early. At this point, I don't try to explain it anymore. I don't look for reasons that make it fit into something normal. I've already gone through that process enough times to know where it leads. What I've settled on is simpler than that. There are places where something can exist without staying. There are things that don't belong to a single location. And sometimes, if you happen to stop in the wrong place at the wrong time, you don't just see it, you get noticed by it. I still camp. I still go out into the woods. But I don't take chances with things that feel off. And if I ever walk into a clearing again and see a tent already set up, with no one around, I won't check it. I won't call out. I won't even step closer. I'll turn around and leave, no matter how far I've come. Because I don't think that tent was ever meant to be found. I think it was waiting for someone to open it.